The first gunshot wasn't meant for her, but the second bullet tore straight through her side. Hannah McBride staggered as though the ground had turned to water beneath her boots. She pressed her palm hard against the burning pain under her ribs, feeling the warmth of her own blood spreading fast through the coarse fabric of her dress. Around her, the saloon doors banged open, swinging wildly in the hot evening wind. As the shouting voices of men spilled out into the main street, someone screamed. A horse reared against its reins. Another gunshot cracked, echoing down the row of wooden storefronts. But by then Hannah was already stumbling forward, every step a fight against the pull of the earth. The street of Dry Creek was alive with chaos. Dust churned in the fading sunlight, stirred up by boots and hooves alike. A lantern had tipped somewhere, its flame licking against the side of a wagon. She could hear glass breaking, men cursing, women calling out names that were swallowed by the uproar. But Hannah barely saw any of it. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel, where every face blurred, and only the dull roar of her own blood reached her ears. The air smelled of whiskey and gunpowder, thick and sharp. She felt the sting of it in her throat as she coughed, then groaned when the movement made her wound flare hot. With trembling fingers, she clutched at her side, but her hand came away slick and red. For one wild moment, she thought about her father's ranch, once green pastures now lost to drought and debt. She thought of the mornings when her mother would sing while hanging wash on the line. Back when Hannah was a little girl, safe in a world that hadn't yet broken her. She thought of the name she had whispered in her fevered dreams many nights, Chenoa, and her heart squeezed painfully. She had promised never to forget, but promises meant little when death walked so close. Hannah! A voice called, distant, almost dreamlike. She tried to turn her head, but her knees buckled and she dropped to the hard-packed dirt. The world tilted. The lamps along the street blurred into long smears of light, stars dripping down into the desert sky. She tried to push herself up, but her arms shook too hard. The pain roared louder than the crowd, louder than the hooves pounding somewhere down the street. She pressed her cheek against the dust, cool against her fevered skin, and thought, so this is how it ends. Shot down in a town that doesn't even know my name. But just as the dark began to close in around her, someone lifted her. Strong arms swept her up, and for the first time since the bullet hit, she felt steady. She blinked and found herself staring into a face half shadowed by the lamplight. A man with weathered skin, a beard streaked with gray, and eyes like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "Hold on," he muttered, more to himself than to her. His voice was deep, roughened by dust and silence, but there was something steady in it, something that cut through the haze of pain. He shifted her carefully in his arms, her head lolling against his chest. The man moved fast, boots striking hard against the wooden planks of the walkway, then crunching into the dirt road. A horse neighed close by, hooves clattering as it was pulled free of the hitching post. Hannah barely felt the jolt as he swung her up onto the saddle before climbing up behind her. The leather creaked, and then the horse lunged forward, galloping hard out of the chaos of Dry Creek. The ride blurred into rhythm, the pounding of hooves, the rocking of the saddle, the harsh breath of the horse carrying them through the night. Every time she thought she would slip into unconsciousness, the man's arm tightened around her, holding her steady. The desert air whipped against her face, carrying with it the dry, bitter scent of sagebrush. Above, the stars stretched endless, sharp and cold. Like diamonds scattered across black velvet. Hannah tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. Only a faint sound escaped, half groan, half whisper. Still, the man heard. "Save your strength," he said, leaning close. She felt the rumble of his voice in his chest, steady as the beating of his heart. For the first time since the bullet struck, she felt a flicker of safety, fragile but real. She wasn't alone. Her last thought before the darkness took her was simple, desperate and strange. Don't let me die before dawn." Daniel Harlow hadn't meant to linger in Dry Creek that night. He had ridden in only for supplies, flour, lamp oil, nails for the corral fence. He kept his head low and his voice quiet. Just another weathered rancher passing through a town that liked its whiskey more than it liked men like him. But fate had other plans. The moment he saw the young woman collapse in the dust, blood darkening her dress, he knew he couldn't just ride away. Now, racing across the open desert with her cradled against his chest, Daniel urged his bay, gelding harder. The horse's flanks gleamed with sweat under the moonlight, hooves drumming the earth in a steady rhythm. Every breath Hannah took was shallow, fragile, like a candle flame about to flicker out. Daniel pressed a hand gently against her wound, trying to staunch the bleeding, though his rough palm came away sticky and warm. "Hold on, girl," he muttered, his voice low but steady. He didn't even know her name, but it didn't matter. Right now, she was his responsibility. The night air bit cold against his skin as the wind whipped past, carrying the scents of sagebrush and dust. Coyotes yipped in the distance, their cries chasing the horse's pounding hooves. The stars above were brilliant, endless, but Daniel had no eye for beauty tonight. All he could see was the pale face pressed against his chest, the faint tremor of her lips as though she fought to form words. At last his ranch house came into view, a lonely silhouette against the silvered land. 2 chimneys, a sagging porch, fences stretching out into the dark. It wasn't much, just weathered boards and sweat holding it all together, but it was the only home he had, and tonight it would have to serve as a sick room. Daniel swung off the saddle in one motion, lifting Hannah with a care that surprised even him. Her body was feather-light in his arms, though heavy with the weight of blood loss. He pushed the door open with his boot and stepped inside, the warm glow of the oil lamp on the table casting long shadows across the room. The house smelled of leather and smoke, of beans simmered earlier that evening, now gone cold. He laid her on his bed, the only real comfort in the house, and stripped away the bloodied fabric from her side. The sight made his jaw clench, an ugly, ragged wound, deep enough to have ended her already. She had grit, this one. She had fought her way to the street, fought to keep breathing. Daniel grabbed a basin, filled it with water from the jug, and set it beside the bed. His hands, rough from years of rope and reins, trembled as he cleaned the wound with strips of cloth torn from an old shirt. Hannah flinched even in her half-conscious state, a soft moan slipping from her lips. Daniel muttered apologies under his breath, though he doubted she could hear. "Easy now. You're safe here. I'll see you through this." When the bleeding slowed, he pressed a clean cloth against the wound and bound it tight with a strip of leather cord. It wasn't the work of a doctor, but it was the best a rancher could do. Hannah stirred, her eyelids fluttering. Her gaze caught his, just for a moment, and her lips parted as if to speak. Daniel leaned closer, catching only a whisper. "Don't. Let them find me." Then she fell limp again, her breath shallow but steady. Daniel sat back, scrubbing a hand across his face. Questions crowded his mind. Who was she? Why had she been shot? And who was she running from? But the answers would have to wait. Right now, survival came first. He pulled a chair to her bedside and sat down heavily, his rifle leaning against the wall within reach. Outside, the desert wind rattled the shutters, carrying with it the distant sounds of the town still restless under the weight of gunfire. Daniel knew men who shot a woman down wouldn't let unfinished business lie. For years, Daniel had lived with silence, his only company the creak of fence posts and the sigh of the wind across his land. He had thought he'd buried his days of fighting along with his brother, gone to dust years back in the border wars. But looking at the pale figure on his bed, her chest rising and falling in fragile rhythm, he knew something deep inside. The past had come knocking again, and it wasn't going to let him stay quiet this time. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and kept his eyes on her face. "Rest now," he murmured. "Tomorrow I'll find a way." But even as he spoke, his heart clenched. Doctors didn't work for free, and medicine was dear. His pockets were near empty, and what little coin he had wouldn't last beyond the week. To save this woman, he would have to sacrifice more than he ever imagined, and Daniel Harlow had precious little left to give. The morning sun bled red across the horizon, spilling light over Daniel Harlow's ranch. The air was cool, sharp with the smell of dew on sagebrush, but the weight on Daniel's chest was heavy as stone. He had spent the night watching Hannah breathe, each rise and fall of her chest a small victory against death. She was alive, but the wound was festering. He knew enough about sickness to see where it would lead if he did nothing by dawn. His decision was made. Daniel stepped into the corral where his black stallion stood waiting. The animal lifted its proud head, dark mane glinting in the early light. The horse was more than property. It was memory, freedom, and years of care bound in muscle and spirit. Daniel had raised him from a skittish colt to the powerful mount that had carried him through drought, storm, and wild country. If there was one thing in this world Daniel truly loved, it was this horse. He placed a hand on the stallion's strong neck, his fingers brushing through the coarse mane. "Forgive me, boy," he murmured, his voice rough. The animal nudged his shoulder in return. Unaware of the fate Daniel had already decided. By mid-morning, Daniel was in Dry Creek again. The town smelled of stale whiskey and smoke from the previous night's gunfire. Men lounged outside the saloon with red-rimmed eyes, and women swept broken glass from the boardwalk. Daniel didn't stop to speak to anyone. He led the stallion by the reins, every step heavier than the last, until he reached the blacksmith's yard, where horses were appraised, traded, and sold. "Fine animal," the blacksmith said, circling the stallion with greedy eyes. "Best I've seen in years. He'll fetch a high price." Daniel swallowed hard. "He's worth every cent you'll give, and I'll take coin, not promises." The bargain was struck quickly. Too quickly. When the blacksmith handed over the pouch of coins, Daniel felt something inside him tear loose. The stallion whinnied, ears flicking as if sensing the betrayal. Daniel turned away before the ache in his chest could choke him, but it wasn't enough. Not for what Hannah needed. Daniel walked the dusty street straight to the office of Dr. Samuel Price. The man was stern, always calculating, and as Daniel placed the coins on the desk, the doctor's eyes narrowed. "This will cover the medicine," Price said, voice cool as steel. "But the visits, the risk. Treating a gunshot wound isn't simple." "I'll need more?" "More?" Daniel asked, his jaw tightening. "I gave you a horse worth more than half this town. Medicine doesn't run on sentiment, Harlow," the doctor replied. "If you want her to live, you'll have to pay." Daniel stared at the coins, everything he had left of his stallion, and felt the weight of another decision pressing down. Slowly, painfully, he drew a folded deed from his pocket. Half of his ranch, the very land his father had worked and buried his bones in. Land Daniel had sworn he would never let go of. He laid it on the desk. "Take it." The doctor blinked, then smiled thinly. "That will do." Daniel's hand lingered on the parchment a moment longer, then pulled away as though burned. He turned on his heel and walked out before the grief could swallow him whole. By noon, he was back at his ranch. The sun blazed high, the air dry as bone. Daniel pushed through the door, the weight of loss crushing him, only to hear the faintest sound from the bed. Hannah stirred. Her lips parted, a whisper escaping. "Water." Daniel rushed to her side, tilting a cup carefully to her mouth. She drank, weak but desperate, and when she lay back, her eyes fluttered open just enough to meet his. For the first time, Daniel saw the color of them clear green, like spring leaves after rain. "You're safe," he said softly, though he didn't feel safe himself. He had given away nearly everything to buy this fragile moment. Hannah's gaze drifted, and a tear slid down her cheek. "Why?" she breathed. Daniel paused, then answered the only way he knew how. "Because someone had to." As the afternoon shadows stretched long across the floorboards, Daniel sat at her bedside, exhaustion tugging at him. He had lost his horse. He had lost his land. And yet, when he looked at the fragile young woman clinging to life, he realized he hadn't lost everything. Not yet. The desert wind whistled through the cracks of the ranch house, carrying with it the smell of dry earth and the faint tang of sagebrush. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with the metallic scent of blood and the sharp bite of whiskey Daniel had poured over Hannah's wound to keep rot at bay. The little cabin that had always felt too quiet for one man now pulsed with her ragged breaths, her soft moans, her whispered words that made the hair rise on the back of Daniel's neck. He hadn't slept. Not really. He dozed in the chair by the bed, jerking awake every time Hannah stirred. The lamp burned low, shadows flickering against the walls. Daniel leaned forward, adjusting the bandage pressed tight to her side, his rough hands surprisingly gentle for a man who'd spent his life breaking wild horses and hammering fence posts into unforgiving soil. Her eyelids fluttered. Beads of sweat clung to her pale forehead. Her lips moved, but the words came broken, slurred. "Chenoa." "Chenoa." Daniel froze. He leaned closer. The name came again, weak and wavering, but filled with a kind of grief he recognized. Not grief for a thing, but for a person. He dipped the cloth into the basin of cool water, wrung it out, and laid it gently across her brow. "Hush now," he muttered, though his mind gnawed at the sound of that name. Rest. But Hannah didn't rest. Not fully. Her fever carried her into dreams, and Daniel could only sit there, listening, piecing together fragments she didn't know she was giving him. "Don't leave me, Chenoa." "I didn't want to run." "Forgive me." Her voice cracked into a sob, then dissolved into a moan of pain. Daniel sat stiff, his jaw tight. The name carried weight, the kind of weight a person never spoke unless it was carved deep into their soul. Whoever this Chenoa was, he wasn't just a passing figure in Hannah McBride's life out by morning. The fever had eased slightly. Pale light spilled through the shutters, painting narrow beams across the room. Daniel set a tin cup of broth on the table, then sat again, his elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the woman in his bed. She stirred, lashes fluttering, and for a moment he thought she might wake. But instead, her lips parted with another whisper. This time, it was clearer. "They'll come. They'll find me." Daniel leaned forward, the words prickling at his skin. "Who'll come?" he asked, voice low, steady. He wasn't sure if he wanted an answer, but Hannah drifted back into silence, her breath shallow, but even Daniel pushed back in his chair, dragging a hand over his beard. He'd spent years avoiding other people's fights, years convincing himself that solitude was safer than siding with anyone. Yet here he was, half his land gone, his horse sold, his bed occupied by a stranger who brought trouble that hadn't yet shown its face. Still, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. He remembered the way she had looked in town, stumbling, clutching her wound, her face a mask of pain and determination. He remembered the faint sound of her voice against his chest as he rode hard for home. She hadn't asked for his help, but she hadn't turned away from it either, and Daniel Harlow wasn't the kind of man who left someone to die in the dust. Not anymore. Outside, the day brightened, the sky a fierce blue. A hawk circled overhead, its cry cutting through the silence of the plains. Daniel stepped onto the porch for a breath of air, his rifle resting easy in his grip. He scanned the horizon, eyes narrowing at the vast emptiness stretching in every direction. No riders, not yet, but he knew trouble was coming. Hannah's fever had told him as much. When he stepped back inside, she had turned in her sleep, her hand clutching weakly at the blanket. Her lips moved again, almost silently. Chenoa. Daniel sat back down, his heart heavy with questions. Who was this man or woman? A lover? A brother? A ghost from her past that hunted her even now? He didn't know. All he knew was that the name lingered in the room long after her whisper faded, settling deep into the wood and stone, a shadow that would not leave Dot as the sun climbed higher. Daniel tightened the bandages again, spooned a little broth between her lips, and sat back, his storm-gray eyes on her face. The world outside was still, but the name Chenoa echoed in his mind like distant thunder, and thunder, he knew, never came without a storm. The wind picked up at sundown, rattling the shutters against the frame of the ranch house. Daniel Harlow sat at Hannah's bedside, the lamplight casting deep shadows over the room. He had grown used to her restless murmurs, the fever-born whispers of Chenoa, but tonight there was something different. Her breathing had steadied, her color returned just enough to give her face life again. For the first time since he carried her from Dry Creek, Daniel felt she was fighting her way back from the edge. Then her eyes opened, not the half-lidded glaze of fever, but wide, green, and startlingly clear. She stared at the ceiling for a moment before her gaze drifted, slow but deliberate, to where Daniel sat. Her voice, though weak, carried more weight than any dream. You shouldn't have done it. Daniel leaned forward, his rough hands still resting on the edge of the bed. Done what? Her lips trembled as she swallowed. You sold your horse. Your land. I heard you talking to the doctor. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He hadn't thought she'd been awake enough to notice. It doesn't matter, he said. What matters is keeping you alive. Hannah turned her head, wincing from the movement, and fixed her gaze on him. There was gratitude in her eyes, but also fear. You don't understand, she whispered. They'll come, Daniel. I was running from them. I thought I'd lost them in Dry Creek, but they won't let me go. Not ever. Daniel's storm-gray eyes narrowed. Who's coming? Her breathing quickened, a flash of panic breaking through her exhaustion. Apache riders, warriors. My past caught up with me, and it won't stop until it's standing at your door. The name she had whispered for nights, Chenoa, hung unsaid on her lips. Daniel studied her face, weighing her words like he did the shifting clouds before a storm. This Chenoa you keep calling out for, he said slowly. Is he the one leading them? Hannah's eyes glistened, and for a moment she looked so young, so broken, Daniel almost regretted asking. Chenoa is my brother, she said, voice cracking. We were children when the raids came, when our family was torn in half. He was taken. I was left behind. Years later, I found him again, but he wasn't the boy I remembered. He was different, fierce, bound to a people who saw me as a traitor for leaving. She turned her face away, tears slipping down her temple into the pillow. I didn't betray him, Daniel. I didn't, but when I refused to go back, he swore he'd find me. He swore he'd drag me home or bury me in the dirt. Daniel sat back, his jaw set. Outside, the coyotes had begun their nightly song, their cries weaving through the desert air like a warning. He'd heard many tales of Apache warriors, some fair, some fear-driven, but one thing rang true in all of them. They never stopped until their will was done. You should have let me die in the street, Hannah whispered, her voice thin, bitter with self-blame. Now you've brought their fury to your door. Daniel reached across the space between them, his hand resting lightly on her trembling fingers. I don't regret saving you, he said. Not for a second. She turned her face back toward him, eyes wet and searching. But at what cost? Daniel didn't answer right away. He had already paid a heavy price, his horse, his land, his security. But cost was never measured in coin alone. It was measured in blood, in battles, in choices that left scars deeper than any knife. Finally, he said, If they come, I'll face them. That's the only answer I have. Hannah closed her eyes, a shiver running through her despite the blanket pulled high under her chin. You don't know what you're saying, she murmured. You don't know him. You don't know Chenoa. Daniel sat silent, listening to the wind pressing against the walls, the hollow creak of the porch boards shifting in the night. No, he didn't know Chenoa. But he knew himself. And he knew one thing with certainty: he had faced loss, loneliness, and violence before. If the storm came again, he would not run. He glanced once more at Hannah, her lashes damp, her breath shallow but steady. Then he rose, lifting his rifle from its place by the wall. Stepping onto the porch, he looked out at the desert night stretching endless in every direction. The stars burned sharp and cold, and in the stillness between coyote cries, he thought he heard something faint. A drumbeat. A rhythm like hooves in the distance. Whether it was his imagination or the first sign of trouble, Daniel didn't know. But Hannah's warning echoed in his mind, chilling as the desert wind. They'll come. The first light of dawn spilled across the desert, painting the horizon in bands of red and gold. Daniel Harlow had not slept. He sat on the porch with his rifle resting across his knees, his boots planted firmly on the creaking boards, his gray eyes fixed on the distance. Every nerve in his body strained for sound. The coyotes had fallen silent hours ago. Even the wind had gone still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Inside, Hannah McBride stirred restlessly, her fever easing but her mind heavy with dread. She had whispered his name through the night, Chenoa. A brother turned stranger, a childhood bond hardened into something like vengeance. Her warning had crawled into Daniel's bones and stayed there. He knew something was coming. Then he heard it doubt at first, faint as the heartbeat of the earth itself. Hoofbeats, steady, many. Daniel rose slowly to his feet, lifting the rifle into his arms. From the ridge beyond the dry creek bed, shadows emerged. One rider, then 3, then 10, and then more, until the horizon was blackened by the silhouettes of mounted warriors. They came in silence, their horses moving with uncanny rhythm, their bodies straight-backed and unshaken. Spears tipped with glinting iron caught the morning sun. Bows and rifles rested easily in their hands. And at their head rode a man Daniel did not need Hannah to name. Chenoa. He was taller than Daniel expected, his broad chest bare but for bands of turquoise and bone strung across his shoulders. His long black hair flowed down his back, catching the light like a raven's wing. His face, strong and unyielding, bore scars that told of battles Daniel couldn't imagine. But it was his eyes that cut deepest. They burned with something between sorrow and fire, as if he had carried rage for so long it had reshaped him. The riders fanned out, circling the ranch house in silence. Dust rose beneath their horses' hooves, curling around the wooden posts of the porch. Daniel stood unmoving, rifle gripped firm, though his heart hammered against his ribs. He knew this wasn't the kind of standoff a single man won by force. Chenoa reined in his horse at the foot of the porch steps. For a long moment he said nothing. The morning light stretched, the silence so heavy Daniel thought it might break the sky itself. Then Chenoa spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of command. "Give her to me." Daniel's jaw tightened. "She's inside, sick. She won't survive another day's ride." Chenoa's gaze flickered, not in weakness but in recognition. "She is my blood," he said. "She belongs with me. She turned her back on our people, on me, but I will not let her die in a stranger's house." Daniel shifted his stance, his rifle still at the ready. "She's under my roof. And as long as she is, I'll see her safe." The words fell between them like iron. For a breath, Daniel thought Chenoa might order his men forward, might unleash the fury Hannah had warned him of. But instead, the Apache warrior dismounted, his boots crunching against the hard-packed earth. He stepped closer, his presence towering, his eyes burning into Daniel's. "You do not understand," Chenoa said, each word sharp as a blade. "I swore an oath before the fire of my people. If she refuses to come with me, then the ground will take her." That is the way. Behind him, the circle of warriors remained still as stone, their faces unreadable, their hands resting on weapons but not yet raised. Daniel's storm-gray eyes did not waver. "Then maybe it's time to choose another way." The two men stood locked in silence, dawn spreading full behind them, painting the world in blood-red light. Inside, Hannah stirred again, her weak voice carrying through the open window. "Chenoa!" The sound of her voice, raw and trembling, made Chenoa's head turn ever so slightly. In that moment, the fire in his eyes flickered with something else memory, maybe even pain. Daniel saw it. And he knew this was no ordinary siege. It was a battle of blood, of family, of promises broken and oaths unbent. By dawn, the Apache had come. But the war between them was only just beginning. The desert dawn burned hotter as the silence thickened. Dust hung in the air, kicked up by the restless circle of Apache horses. Every eye was fixed on the standoff, Daniel Harlow standing firm on his porch with a rifle in his hands, and Chenoa, the towering warrior, his chest marked by scars and turquoise beads that glinted in the sun, behind Daniel. Hannah McBride stirred, her weak voice cutting through the tension like a fragile blade. "Chenoa." The sound froze him. For the first time since arriving, the fierce commander faltered. His head turned slightly toward the window, his jaw tightening as if her voice had reached inside the armor he wore across his soul. Daniel saw it, the crack in the steel. He lowered his rifle, not surrendering, but shifting it, showing he was no fool and no coward. "She's alive because I sold the only things I had left," Daniel said, his voice steady but carrying the ache of sacrifice. "My land, my horse, everything. I didn't save her to hand her over to die under your oath." Chenoa's gaze snapped back to him, sharp as a knife. "You speak of sacrifice, rancher? You do not know the weight of blood. She left me. She left our people. She chose the world of fences and plows over her own kin. I swore before the fire, if she turned from us, I would bring her back, or I would bury her." Hannah's voice trembled again, stronger this time. "No, Chenoa." The front door creaked open. Daniel half turned, alarm flashing in his eyes, but Hannah stood there, barefoot, wrapped in a quilt, pale as the morning sky but upright, defiant. Her green eyes, rimmed with fever and tears, locked onto her brother's. "You swore before the fire," she said, her voice carrying a quiet strength. "But I never swore with you. You think I betrayed you, but I was a child. I was broken. You were taken, and when I found you again, you weren't my brother anymore. You were someone else's warrior." The circle of riders shifted uneasily, their horses snorting, hooves pawing at the earth. They waited for their leader, for Chenoa, whose face was unreadable as stone. Daniel moved to Hannah's side, steadying her with a hand, but she brushed him away. "This was her fight. I loved you, Chenoa," she said, her voice breaking but steady. "I still do. But love isn't chains. It isn't oaths. It isn't dragging someone back into a life that will kill them. You swore to bury me if I wouldn't come. Do it now, if that's truly the brother you've become." Her words hung in the air, heavy as the desert heat. For a long moment, no one moved. Chenoa's eyes burned. His jaw flexed. His hand hovered at the knife strapped to his hip. The riders behind him shifted closer, as if waiting for the command to strike. Daniel's heart thundered. His finger tightened on the rifle, though it remained lowered. He was ready to fight, ready to die, but the decision wasn't his to make. Finally, Chenoa's hand dropped from the knife. His chest rose and fell, every breath a war between rage and grief. He turned his face to the ground for the briefest moment, and when he looked back at Hannah, something in his eyes had changed. Not forgiveness, not surrender, but release. "You are no longer mine to claim," he said, voice low, hoarse with loss. He stepped back, lifting his hand in signal. The circle of warriors shifted. One by one, horses turned, hooves pounding as they wheeled away from the ranch. Dust rose like a storm in their wake until only Chenoa remained, his black hair whipping in the wind, his turquoise jewelry glinting in the sun. He looked at Hannah one last time, his eyes carrying 1,000 things he could not say. Then he swung into the saddle and rode hard after his people, his figure shrinking against the red horizon until he was gone. Silence fell again. The desert seemed to exhale. Hannah swayed, her strength nearly gone, and Daniel caught her, guiding her back inside. She collapsed against him, trembling, her tears hot against his chest. "It's over," he whispered, though he knew it wasn't truly over. Ghosts like that never vanished completely. Still, for now, she was alive. For now, the ranch still stood. For now, Dawn had given them another chance, and that was enough.